Did anybody have any questions from last week? In that handout, there was a list on logical fallacies, common logical fallacies, and we didn't go over those just for time's sake. Did anybody have any questions about those you wanted to ask before we jump into this week's lesson? Are we missing those things? Are we missing? Yes? You have a question? You can ask a question anytime you want to, okay, Hadley? Okay. This week, we're going to begin talking about arguments for the existence of God. All right, so start with the basics. Who's that guy there? Anybody tell me? Vince Lombardi. You cheated, didn't you? Okay, who can tell me who Vince Lombardi is? He is said to be the greatest football coach in the NFL. Very, very, very gifted football coach. And he's really known for stressing the fundamentals of the game. In fact, whenever he would get his team in at the start of the season to start training, he would go in there and he'd stand around these guys, professional football players, guys who had been drafted out of college, star athletes, been playing football their whole lives. He'd stand up in front of them and he'd hold a football and he'd say, "Gentlemen, this is a football." He started with the absolute basics. And that's what we're going to do in here. Tonight we're starting with the real basics once we're getting into the meat of apologetics. Does God exist? That's the real basics. Go back to the most basic level. If you can convince somebody that God exists, you've got them headed down the right path. They're not necessarily at the right place yet, but they're heading down the right path if you can start them with that. And much of what we're going to be arguing in this, arguing that God exists, much of what we're going to be saying here is actually very simple things, very often common sense things that we all already know, but we're going to piece them together in such a way that they demonstrate God does actually exist. Okay? So you can change the slide there. And tonight we're going to talk about the argument for God's existence from cosmology. Anybody know what cosmology is? That sounds like cosmos, right? Someone says the cosmos. What are they talking about? Stars up in space, the universe, all that. Yeah. Basically, cosmology is the study of the universe. The argument for God's existence from the universe. Now, some of the things we're going to talk about may find just a little bit challenging, but just keep an open mind and try to look at it from a good perspective here to see exactly how we're arguing this. Okay? What is the very first revelation that the Bible tells you? Out of everything in the whole Bible, what's the very first revelation? Yeah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the very first statement in the Bible. Very simple, plain matter of fact. Now, I'm going to be referencing verses of Scripture throughout these lectures. But the purpose we're referencing these, please understand, the purpose I'm bringing in Bible Scriptures here is not to just say, see, the Bible says it and that proves it. That doesn't work with somebody who doesn't have the same respect for the Bible. Rather, what we're doing is we're showing that what we're talking about here is perfectly, completely, totally in line with Christian faith. And this cosmological argument is perfectly in line with Christian faith. The first claim of the Bible can be scientifically proven, and that claim proves God's existence as well. That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, you guys remember last week, or 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, we talked about logic, and we explained that logical argument. You have two or more premises, and if they're true, then they lead to a conclusion. Remember that? Okay, go ahead and change the slide there. This is how we're going to phrase a lot of these arguments. And there's a lot of versions of the cosmological argument. This is called the Kalam cosmological argument. Premise number 1 is anything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, and the conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause. The universe has a cause. That's really the main thing we're focusing on. We want to show that the universe, something caused the universe to come into existence. Now, the logic of that is perfectly sound. You can't argue with the logic. But let's talk about the premises. Premise 1, anything that begins to exist has a cause. Let's talk about that first of all. Okay? Is a cause really necessary? You can change the slide now. Is a cause really necessary for something to happen? Can something happen without a cause? No, there are three reasons that we have to have a cause, okay? The first reason is metaphysical intuition. This goes back to simple law of logic. The laws of causality demand that any event have something that causes it. Anything that really starts must be caused by something. Now, can you guys read that comic there? Two nails are standing, and then I heard a loud bang, and when I turned back, he was gone. What happened to his friend? He just disappeared. Loud noise. He disappeared. Something happened, right? There was some sort of a cause. Something had to have happened. Just doesn't figure out what it is. The law of causality demands for any event there has to be a cause. Okay? The second reason is the absence of the contrary. And this sounds a little silly, but just try to understand it the way it is. Elephants, socket wrenches, and Dodge Chargers don't magically pop into existence. All right? We never see this happening. If something is going to come into existence without a cause, then why doesn't it happen? We never see that happen. And the last one is personal experience. No one, including any of you in here, can name anything that ever began to exist that does not have a cause. All right? Everything had something that caused it. So, let's talk about each of these three in a little bit more detail. The law, you can go ahead and change it. The law of causality simply states that something cannot come from nothing. Every effect has a cause. You guys get the chicken and egg joke there? Makes sense? No, you back off. I was here before you. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? One had to come from the other, and ultimately they both had to come from something. Right? The chicken came first. I think that makes more sense too, actually. But, they had to come from something. They didn't just begin to exist for no reason. Right? This is very simple logic. It makes a lot of sense. Everything has a cause. I can take this pen and I can drop it over and over again into my hand. And it falls to my hand. It begins to fall. Its free fall essentially has a beginning. And that free fall has a cause. The law of gravity pulls it down. My hand is letting go so that the law of gravity can take over. Everything has a cause. Okay? In fact, this concept is kind of common sense, but it's been formally stated at least for 2,300 years. Aristotle's the first person we know of for sure that's actually said formally, everything must have a cause. Everything that begins must have a cause. Okay? I'm going to try to get through the night pretty quick because I can tell some of you guys are concerned. You can be honest with me if you're worried. Some of you are afraid that a horse has materialized inside your house and is running a wreck and destroying everything, right? You can be honest with me. Who in here is afraid that has happened? Janie, are me and Janie the only ones that are actually afraid that a horse has just appeared in our house? All right. You can change the slide. The absence of the contrary. No one is concerned that a horse has suddenly appeared in your house and is running around ruining everything. Why aren't you concerned about that? Because that's a silly idea. Things don't just come into existence for no reason whatsoever. If the law of causality were not true, this would happen all the time. You would see things coming into existence out of nothing, and yet it never ever happens. Quick quote here by William Lane Craig. He's really sort of known for making this argument for God's existence famous. Very intelligent man, and he kind of uses a little humor here. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer come into being out of nothing? Why is it only universes that can pop into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? There can't be anything about nothing that favors universes, for nothingness doesn't have any properties, nor can anything constrain nothing, since there isn't anything to be constrained. There was nothing, and then there was something. There has to be some degree, there has to be something that caused that transition, that caused things to begin to exist. You don't have things popping into existence from nothing. Okay, now you'll notice in your notebooks, there is a blank there. Let me look it up so I get the exact wording. And this is the fun part. This is where you get to use your imagination. Blank does not magically pop into existence for no reason. You can put anything in that blank that you want to. You can put in, torque wrenches. You can put in elephants. I put in Eskimo villages. Anything you want to put in there. Just to make the point, things don't pop into existence from absolutely nothing. And there's one more reason we know, and that is personal experience. Okay? If you are sitting in your house, and all of a sudden you hear a loud crash, you're going to get up and you're going to run through the house and try to figure out what that was. You may run through your house, you don't find anything has actually happened. Nothing has changed. Everything's exactly the way it is. So maybe you go into your spouse and you say, honey, what was that noise? And she just says, well, what noise? That loud crash that just happened. Oh, that was just a loud noise. Well, I know it was a loud noise, but why did it just happen? Well, it just happens. Things like that happen all the time. Well, things don't happen all the time. You're going to assume she's hiding something from you at that point, because things don't just happen for no reason. Our personal experience confirms that. No one can name anything that has ever begun to exist without a cause. And here's the thing. When we're talking about people who don't believe in God, very commonly, they have a worldview of either scientism or materialism. Anybody remember last week what we talked about scientism? We gave an example of scientism. Anybody remember what that is? Scientism. Looking in the notes. And the question after that's going to be, what's materialism? So if anybody knows that, you can go ahead and answer it too. What is scientism? We can only know what science can prove. We can only know the things that are scientifically proven. Most people you adhere to who don't believe in God are going to have that belief, or they're going to be something like materialism. What's materialism claim? Only the material world exists. The only things we can really know are the things in the material world. Things we can see, study, touch, smell, experiment with. And yet for someone to claim, to deny the concept that things don't begin on their own, then they're rejecting what's materialism. We've never seen that happen. We've never experienced that, and yet we're claiming that it happens anyway. That's what someone would be claiming if they say things can come into existence on their own. And so essentially, they'd be having to take a step based entirely on blind faith. And that's exactly the thing that many atheists want to avoid, is blind faith. But that's essentially what they claim. Okay, does that make sense? Anything that begins to exist has a cause. Have we thoroughly discussed that point? Any questions on that? Okay. Let's go on to premise number 2. The universe began to exist. Did the universe really begin to exist? Now this is where it may be a little challenging, but the fact is Christians and atheists both agree on this point. We both agree that the universe, there was absolutely nothing, there was nothingness, and then there was something. The universe began to exist. We both believe it happened. We disagree about what it's called. Christians typically call it creation. Atheists will often call it the Big Bang. By the way, current Big Bang cosmology actually says that there was absolutely nothing, and then the whole universe came into existence out of that absolute nothingness. The real big difference is how and why. Atheists have absolutely no explanation for how the universe began to exist. Christians do. We take it a step further and we say, we know it happened. Okay, why did it happen? What caused it to happen? Little note down there at the bottom, we may disagree about how, when, and why, but the point is we agree that it happened. Most people agree with this, that the universe began to exist. And now here's the thing that's going to be kind of challenging. You can go ahead and change the slide there. Christians do not need to be afraid of the Big Bang theory. Oftentimes someone says, I believe the Big Bang, we sort of step back and say, whoa, you are way out there in left field. I don't connect with you at all on that. We say we're Christians, we don't believe in the Big Bang. But the fact is, the Big Bang theory is one way of theorizing exactly what happened when the universe came into existence. And in fact, if it is true that the universe began exactly as the Big Bang theory predicts, that is only evidence for God. That only means that the universe began to exist, and therefore there has to be a cause to that. All right? In fact, the first person to actually theorize what was called the Big Bang theory was a guy named Lemaitre. That's a picture of him right there. He was a Jesuit priest, believe it or not. So if you ever talk to somebody and they say, well, I can't believe in God, I believe in the Big Bang theory, you say, really? Do you know where the Big Bang theory came from? It came from a priest. It came from somebody who believes in God. But we kind of can tend to get a little upset. Many times this claim of the Big Bang theory, whether it's true or not, has been used to sort of attack Christianity and attack belief in God. But what many people don't realize is that the Big Bang Theory doesn't make any sense if there is no God. Because you'd have a cause, or you have an event without a cause. So if a non-believer claims that the universe began to exist in the Big Bang, then this argument we're talking about, the cosmological argument, is perfect for them because they're already pointed in the right direction. They believe it began to exist. They just need to go a step further and ask, okay, why does it exist? What caused it to exist? Okay, and really quick, let's do some really quick, simple science. How do we know that the universe began to exist? There's actually quite a few different reasons. There's galaxy seeds, there's the redshift, there's all these different things. The simplest way to know the universe began to exist is a law called the second law of thermodynamics. Basically, you ever heard of that before? The law of entropy. You guys studied that when you were in school? Probably. Don't remember anymore. That's me and 90% of everything I learned in school, so. Law of entropy. Basically, the law of entropy states that any closed system is constantly running out of energy. It's running down. Or basically, it's not really running out of energy. It's going from order to disorder. The energy is being used up and put into a state where it can't be used. For example, if you fill up your car with gas, and then you put some epoxy on the gas cap, and you screw it on and you close that up so you cannot open that car and put gas in it anymore. And you get in your car and you drive and drive and drive. That's a closed system. You can't put anything into it. You can't take anything out of it. But you keep driving and keep driving. What's going to happen to your car eventually? Eventually it's going to run out of gas, right? Because it's running down. It's a closed system and it's running down. If you're not putting anything into it, it can't keep going. And the universe is constantly running down. If it's running down, it means that at some point it's going to run out. And prior to that, it had a set amount of energy. Because if it was just infinity years back, it would have run out already. You know, you can't go infinity years back. The universe began to exist at some point. Now that is the second premise. Does that make sense? Any questions or anything on that? We're going a lot faster than I thought I was. We may get out kind of early here. Okay. So far we have our two premises that are true. The universe, or anything that begins to exist, has a cause. The universe began to exist, but that doesn't quite put us where we need to be just yet. All that tells us is that the universe had a cause. So let's go back, let's refine this concept a little bit, refining the argument here. Basically, the claim is that everything, all time, space, and matter, began to exist when the universe began to exist. It was all a part of that initial beginning of the universe, right? Now that means that whatever caused the universe to exist, it has to be outside of time, space, and matter. So it has to be eternal, spaceless, and immaterial. All right? Now, there are only two things I can think of that are eternal, spaceless, and immaterial. Number one would be an abstract concept, such as the number 5. And the other would be a disembodied consciousness, a being that is not actually a physical being. Now, the number 5 can't cause anything. So therefore, the conclusion is that the cause is a consciousness. It is a personal being. Therefore, we know that this first cause, whatever this first cause is eternal, spaceless, immaterial, and personal. It transcends. This first cause transcends all of those things. It is above all of those things. Does that make sense at all? Okay, let's go back to that very first revelation in the Bible one more time. Genesis 1:1. You can go ahead and change the slide. Genesis 1:1 tells us, in the beginning, that's time, God, a personal being, created the heavens, that's space, and the earth. Do you see where we're going with this? Something outside of time, space, and matter that is a personal being had to have been the cause for the universe, and yet that's exactly what the Bible tells us in the very first verse, the very first sentence of the Bible. So Genesis 1:1 is actually spot on with everything we know about the universe today. Okay, so we've refined that argument down. Are there any questions or anything so far? We're getting really close to being done tonight, so we're actually going to end really quick, way quicker than last time we did this. Okay. Before we actually quit for the night, I want to talk about a few common objections. This is a very popular argument for God's existence, and a lot of people will look at it and argue with it and try to say, for this reason, this argument can't be true. Okay? Let's look at specifically 3 common objections to this argument, and we'll talk about them and kind of explain them. The first objection is the God of the gaps. You ever heard that phrase before, God of the gaps? All right, God of the gaps, we don't want to ever argue from God of the gaps, okay? Essentially, a God of the gaps argument is saying, I don't understand how this happened, therefore it must be God that did it, and so it's evidence of God. And a lot of people look at this argument and say, well, just because we don't understand how the universe came into existence doesn't mean that it was God. They claim that that's a God of the gaps argument. But does that make sense, that claim? Okay, but that's not what we're claiming. We're not saying we don't know and therefore God did it. Rather, we're claiming that scientific findings, the law of logic, common sense, and personal experience demonstrate that the universe had to have a cause. We're not saying we don't know, therefore God. We're saying, hey, this is what makes the most sense of the evidence that we have. Okay, so it's not a God of the gaps argument. It's a claim that God is the first, that there is a first cause, and that cause must be God. Okay? All right, another common objection. And you may have heard this before. Who made God? You ever heard anyone ask that? If God made the whole universe, then who made God? Well, the only thing that could possibly make God would have to be God. So you have to say there was a God that made God. And then you have to say, well, there was a God that made that God then, because you could just ask who made that God. You could just keep going back forever and ever and ever and never stop asking who made God, right? Well, I would say, now Richard Dawkins, you heard of a guy named Richard Dawkins? Very famous atheist, very outspoken, very aggressive against Christianity. Richard Dawkins actually wrote a book on this concept. It's not a very good book, but it's a book where he really pushes this as a reason that we can't believe in God, because we don't know who made God otherwise. But I would argue, you know what, to say who made God, that completely misunderstands what I mean when I say God. When you talk about God, I'm not talking about someone that needs to be created. God is the uncaused first cause. Therefore, there are only 2 options. Something had to exist in the beginning. Something had to start it all. Either the universe has always existed, that's scientifically and logically implausible, or God is eternal. And science doesn't say anything about that, but that makes very good sense logically and theologically. And of those 2, the most logical conclusion is that God is eternal. And finally, someone may say this about this argument, that the first cause was natural. They say, well, sure, there was a first cause. They just deny that that first cause was God. They think that that first cause had to be just something else, something non-intelligent. That doesn't make sense, because when we talk about the universe beginning to exist, nature is a part of the universe. It began to exist in the universe. So you're saying nature created itself. That's not possible. Nothing can create itself because nothing pre-exists itself. Essentially, that's basically the same thing as me saying, give me enough time, and eventually I'll be able to prove to you that I gave birth to my own grandmother. That doesn't happen. That's not possible. It doesn't matter how long I have to figure it out. I'll never be able to prove that because it's impossible. There had to be something completely, entirely outside of the universe that created it. And there's one other objection I was going to bring up. I don't even have it on the slide, but it's a little more technical than what I was going to do. Some people deny that some people think that things do pop into existence from nothing, and they claim it happens at a subatomic level. And if you ever hear that, just know that there's very good reason to know that that does not happen. But just a quick review. Let's go over the whole thing again. The Kalam cosmological argument. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. That cause is eternal, spaceless, immaterial, and personal. And that sounds an awful lot like God to me. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.